Today we've got the ACE lab from PSU to talk about their careers in marine ecology. And so we're gonna I'll let Dr. Granick, as the principal investigator and leader of the lab, just introduce her other lab members, and then they're gonna go and talk about their career paths.
Great. And I just wanted to start by inviting everyone to turn on their video if they feel comfortable doing that. It's always nice to be talking to people and not just to some rectangles. So if you are in a place where you're able to turn it on, that's awesome. Great. It's nice to see faces too. Thank you. And if you can't, I totally get it. But so my name is Elise Granick, and I'm a professor at Portland State University. I'm a marine ecologist, and I run the Applied Coastal Ecology Lab, or the ACE lab at PSU. And so I'm really grateful to Allison and Mara for inviting us to lead one of the lunches. And also thankful to Ellie and Jeff for giving up some of their precious research and studying time this summer to speak with all of you. I run a lab group where we have graduate students and undergraduates, and then sometimes in the summer high school students that work in the lab doing research, usually on collaborative projects to some extent. So research takes a lot of different hands and brains. And so we often do projects having people help us. And it's fun to see Bronte, because Bronte helped Allie with an experiment 2 summers ago now. Is that right? Yeah, 2 summers ago. In the lab, graduate students generally have their own research projects that they sort of carve out that's somehow related to what we do in the lab. And undergraduates actually sometimes also, if they're doing an honors thesis, they'll have their own projects that are carved out. But often undergraduate students are helping with projects in the lab, helping graduate students with projects in the lab. And similarly, ASE high school students in the summer are also. Hi, Skip. So fun. I know Skip from when I was a graduate student at Oregon State. So yeah. So the grad students here are both working on their own research projects that are part of the lab, and I mentor them, but they really lead the research themselves. And so I think what we were tasked with today is sort of giving you some sense of what a path might look like from where you are in high school, or I know Bronte is in college now, but from where you are into a graduate career or an academic career as a professor one day, and how we got to where we are. And so I want to pass the mic to Allie, and she's going to start by speaking about what her path was like from high school to where she is now. And she's had a lot of different experiences. So and maybe let her speak. And then if you have a burning question, you can jump in, or if not, we'll pause between each of us and you can ask individual questions to each of us along the way.
Hi, everybody. Hello to everyone in the classroom and on Zoom. I love talking about this. I feel like growing up throughout my career, my path always felt kind of non-traditional, and I never really heard from other people with similar paths. So I love sharing my experience to get more normalization with that. So I grew up in a rural town. It was kind of a couple hours to the beach, and we didn't go very often. And so I had this burning love for the ocean within me, but I didn't really know that's what I wanted to do, even though my senior project in high school was on ocean ecosystems and all this stuff. I just still didn't think that was going to be my path. And so when I started undergrad, I actually went to college up at Western Washington University, which is in Bellingham, Washington. It's half an hour from the Canadian border, so it's really north. And when I went up there, I started out with a biology major, but I had a really hard time with the weed out classes. I think they're not really calling them that anymore because it's a really unhelpful barrier. Basically, I felt that I couldn't be a scientist because I didn't do very well in chemistry and biology. And I've so many years later figured out that I'm neurodivergent, and I didn't know that then. And so I had a really hard time navigating undergrad. And I almost dropped out until I actually met my advisor. He told me that basically you could major in whatever you wanted and still be a marine scientist as long as you took like certain classes. And so that was actually when I made the switch to environmental science. And so he kind of saved my whole path, which was awesome. And he ended up being my first invertebrate zoology professor, and that was where it just like clicked for me. So for folks who may not know, invertebrates are basically like organisms that don't have spines, right? And for me, marine invertebrates have always just been like my passion. I love that. And so that was kind of when it really clicked for me. We had a field work day where we went to a dock, and he basically told us to just like throw ourselves over and pick off as many things as we could find, carefully, of course. And then we went back and identified them. And so like I was half of my body underwater picking off like anemones and sponge, all sorts of fun stuff, and then looking at them. And that was when I was like, this is what I need to do with my life. And that still is extremely broad. And that was something that I kind of struggled with for a while. You know, I was like, I love invertebrates, that's what I want to do. And people were like, okay, but you have to like pick something within that. And so moving through, I kind of took whatever experience I could get. And so like another barrier that ended up coming up, I faced some ableism later in my undergraduate career. I'm type 1 diabetic, and I also have some other chronic illnesses. And so like I at one point just wanted to be a scientific diver, and they actually wouldn't let me because of my diabetes. But at a scientific conference I went to, I actually met a PhD student who needed a dive assistant. And I mentioned to her that I was diabetic, and she was like, okay, like, so what? And so that was pretty life-changing for me. So I got to work for like I guess it was like 2.5 months in Hawaii as a dive assistant. And that was kind of amazing. We got to dive like 3 times a day. And actually I rolled out that that's not really what I wanted to do with my life, because like diving professionally is a lot of work. But yeah, and so after that, my big moment, I actually ended up meeting the director of a marine lab at a conference, and he was from Chile. And so actually I have some photos, because that was when I really feel like my life pivoted. So let's see if I can present this. Oh, it's got subtitles on, fun. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so everyone should see photos, right? Okay, so this was the lab that I ended up joining. I kind of met the director, who's the one third from the right in the back in the lighter blue shirt. And he basically just told me that I should come down and do an internship. And I was like, yeah, okay. And I didn't realize it was in Chile until much later. But it ended up completely changing my life. And so this was the team that I started with. There are only like 4 of us in the picture, not from Chile. There were 3 of us from the States, and then the one on the far left was from France, and she was actually my roommate. But it was here, I worked in an intertidal lab. And so the intertidal zone is basically that area that's like between the ocean and then the shore, right? Like, so the rocky intertidal is where we are in these photos. And it was amazing getting that practical experience. I got to do some really cool things. Let's see. Okay, so the subtitles are kind of blocking, but you can see I've got some experiences with invertebrates. The one on the right, that's Heliaster. It's like a keystone species, so it's a really important sea star down there, and I got to do a lot of work with that. I got to dive, as you can see on the upper left, and just had a really adventurous time doing sampling in the intertidal. And then it eventually led to me getting to work on a project that ended up being my first publication. And so this is the Chilean kelp crab. We actually do have a couple species up here that are very similar. And so I got to do an experiment looking at how they respond to really, really low oxygen conditions. And it was really fun. So I learned a lot there. And then after I worked through that, basically, honestly, I probably could have lived there forever, but I realized that I really, really wanted to come back to grad school. And the timing worked out. I had been trying for a few years, and it wasn't actually until I met Dr. Granick in a Skype session that I realized that like I really wanted to start, and it clicked for me. And so I came back, and my first project after my first year was involving clams and pesticides. And so I looked at the effects of multiple combinations of pesticides on the softshell clam. And so this was at the very beginning of the pandemic. That's why I have the bandana on my face. But I got to go and collect clams, and it's really funny. You know, they have you do that like draw a scientist thing, and everyone draws the like white lab coat chemist. And I never ever thought I could be there, right, based on my undergrad experience. And then like here I am. I was in the white lab coat doing all the chemistry, and it felt really good. And so that's on the left at the very beginning. That's me dosing the clams, and then that was my final sample period at the very right. And I was just ecstatic. It was really fun. And then in addition to that, I actually have gotten to help out with one of my really close friends who completed her master's this last year. She did her work on eelgrass. And so we got to do like invertebrate surveys. That's me on the left with a clam gun. Basically, we just used it for coring, but you can go down. So coring is where you take like a few inches of mud and then you just figure out what invertebrates are in there. And so that was really fun for me. But yeah, so far that's been my experience. And right now I don't really have any photos recently because I've just been doing computer stuff and I'm studying for my exams this year, but it's been pretty great. Stop share. Yeah, that's been kind of my experience this far.
Awesome. I just have a quick follow-up question while kind of about the steps of your career. And I'm noticing that you said you met Elise in a Skype session. What brought you both to that Skype session? Like, who introduced you?
Yeah, so I actually had heard about her. I am actually a second generation scientist. I will say my dad's actually a marine biologist, and he had mentioned Elise to me. And I don't remember what was I think I emailed her and we had talked, and I was looking at her research, and like at the time on her website, it was mostly like mangrove stuff in Hawaii. And I was like, oh, that sounds really cool. And so I looked at that and it sounded really interesting. And then we connected and it just clicked way better than anyone. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Thanks, Allie. Let's hear from Jeff now. And then, if you have questions, if you think of questions as people are talking, just, make note of them and we'll do more questions at the end in case, different, we might have questions that apply to multiple speaker. All right, can go ahead. I can't hear you.
I literally just said I was saying everything before I unmuted myself. Yeah, so I'm Jeff Safransky. I am a master's student in Dr. Granick's lab. Kind of some similarities with Allie, actually. I grew up in the suburbs of Illinois, and I always had a huge love for invertebrates and marine creatures and like weird things. I got that after watching a show called Wild Discovery, and just thinking that all of like the mantis, shrimp, and all that stuff, and octopi were super cool. And then I always loved being outside and being in nature. My dad would take me camping a lot, and he actually would have me clear non-native species from the camping ground like mustard and plant trees. And actually the very first job I did as an ecologist was clearing non-native mustard out of an area, so I felt like my life had come full circle for a minute there. And so I knew I wanted to do marine biology, and my parents were kind enough to send me on like this 3-week intensive scuba diving trip to the Virgin Islands, where I dove into coral reefs, and I was like blown away. I just loved coral so much, and I really wanted to do marine biology. But also coastal out-of-state schools are expensive, so I went to the University of Illinois at Springfield for the first 2 years with the idea that maybe I would transfer out to another university to study marine biology. And actually there I did learn that you don't necessarily need to get a degree in marine biology to do marine biology. So I actually did get into a school in Norfolk, Virginia, and I was thinking about transferring, but they wanted me to retake more classes. So it'd be like almost 4 years still, even though I completed 2 years out of state tuition. So I decided to stay in Illinois and finish out my degree in just biology. During that time, my grades did dip, and then I got behavioral counseling for ADHD, and I was able to pick my grades back up. Since I graduated with average grades, I decided to spend more time working to build up my resume. In this time, I worked a number of years as a ecological field technician. This is a common job that's available to people who are interested in environmental science or ecology. They have a lot of seasonal jobs where you're doing basic technician work. In these jobs, I worked in Dutch Harbor, Alaska. That was my first job outside of this internship in Illinois. Here, I would be on fishing vessels. I would fly out of Seattle, and we would take like length, weight, species, and sex data on fish. This data was used to actively manage the Alaskan fishery outside of Dutch Harbor in real time by NOAA. It would come, well, almost real time. It would come back to Seattle and we would turn in our data, and then we'd use that to determine like how much fish is actually being pulled out of that area and what species, along with something called bycatch, which is basically everything that the fishermen are pulling out with their gear that they're not targeting and don't want to pull out. From there, I worked in Madagascar. That's actually where I discovered kind of coastal ecosystems and mangrove. I was working in mangroves, and I remember I would walk out in the morning as the sun was rising, and there'd be all of these really cute crabs around, and there just was like so much life and so much fish in these mangroves. I just really loved that. I worked there for a few months in like a work study type of deal. So I actually had to pay to be there, but it was a good opportunity to sort of work with local populations in mangrove ecosystems on fish stuff. From there, I came back to the States, and my next job was a seasonal one where I was working in Ohio. And that was just a brief look to see what non-aquatic ecosystems might be like. I was working with birds and bats. It was very interesting, but I decided to stick with aquatic ecosystems. So from there, I worked for almost a year in Dallas, Texas. I would go all over West Texas taking mussel data. Same thing like mussel, like filter feeder, not mussel, like, actual mussels. And that was a really, really fun job. We were scuba diving in the rivers. We were snorkeling in the rivers. We would go out to West Texas and see these really hard to reach areas where we had to like literally take a truck way off road. And like occasionally I would see the desert in full bloom. It was beautiful. That was a seasonal job, and it came to an end. Then I became a senior research technician at Florida International University, where the responsibilities were similar to a regular research technician, but I was also responsible for training people, maintaining field equipment. I got to drive marine boats. I got to drive airboats. I don't have any pictures of the field work, but if I turn off my video, you can see my picture of me on an airboat with the noise canceling headphones on. Airboats are a fun tool to use during field work. They can be a little scary because they don't have brakes, and the easiest way to control them is to go faster. So occasionally I would just allow myself to drift to a stop into some grass, and I had to like get out and push the airboat back out. So that was my career. It was a lot of field work, a lot of technician work. Eventually it became time for me to go move on to the next step. I loved my traveling around, doing different seasonal jobs. I loved experiencing different parts of the country, different parts of the world. I loved seeing things and experiencing things. I remember, wish I could find some pictures. I remember being on a fishing vessel and then seeing like the sun rise over glaciers, not glaciers, icebergs as they like floated past me. But it was like a very beautiful day. It was like very spring and temperate. So while at FIU, I decided to find a master's program. I found Dr. Granick just by researching into different people who were working on mangroves, actually. Mangrove ecosystems were probably the ecosystem I enjoyed the most while working. And so I reached out to her amongst other places. And one of the reasons why it was appealing to me to come to Portland is because actually my sisters earlier moved from Chicago to Portland. So there was a big draw to be able to find someone who's kind of like in my area doing stuff I liked and was interested in Portland. So I'm super happy to I ended up in the lab that I'm at. And now I'm getting my master's. I have some stuff ready for talking about my project, but I don't know if maybe we can talk about that with other things. And if Elise wants to start with her part.
Yeah, why don't we have Elise talk a
I was
bit?
gonna say, Jeff, really quickly, we could only see your first slide. I don't know if you want to really quickly want to show your other slides for some reason.
The
it
other
wasn't-
slides are about my projects.
Oh, sorry. I thought they were okay. I thought they were pictures of you in the field. Got it.
I couldn't find pictures of me in the field.
Okay. No worries. No worries. Sure. Yeah. So I have not had time to put together slides. I apologize. But I have a very windy path to where I am today. So I was an environmental studies and non-Western history double major undergrad. And I did a lot of work in the environmental field, both volunteering and like jobs kind of early on. And then after I graduated from college, about a year after I went and was a Peace Corps volunteer in East Africa and then in West Africa. And my position was environmental education. So I worked with community groups and taught environmental ed basically. And while I was a Peace Corps volunteer, one of the things that was frustrating was people would ask questions, like I would talk about the environmental issues and environmental problems, and they'd be like, well, how do we solve this one? But I didn't have the ecological background to be able to help them plan all the solutions. Like some things I knew, like, okay, there's deforestation here. Okay, we should plant trees, right? But there were some more complicated questions they had that I couldn't answer their questions and help them strategize on solutions. So I ended up deciding I wanted to go back to graduate school after Peace Corps, when I finished Peace Corps service, to study ecology, basically. So from Peace Corps, I applied from West Africa. I applied to grad school on a really slow computer back then when it was only a dial-up connection. Hold on one sec, I'm sorry. And so I went to grad school on the East Coast and I studied forest ecology and conservation biology. And while I was in grad school, so I had been a Peace Corps volunteer in the Comoros Islands, which are little islands, a little island nation north of Madagascar. And while I was okay, so wait, let me take a step back. So my graduate research was in the Comoros, where I had been a volunteer, and so my research was looking at an endangered fruit bat species. So these giant fruit bats that have a wingspan that's as long as my wingspan. It's like 5 feet long. They're like this tall, and they have little Mickey Mouse ears. They're adorable and they're super social, but their habitat was declining and their populations were declining, and they're really important seed dispersers in forests, because they eat fruit. They're frugivores, so they eat fruit and then carry the seeds elsewhere and deposit the seeds and help the forest continue to grow. And so I was studying what habitat characteristics they needed, because there was discussion about an effort to establish national parks in the islands to protect the fruit bats, but there was no data on what the habitat requirements were, other than that they lived in forests. And in fact, the areas that were least sort of desirable for deforestation in terms of people wanting to plant crops, like deforest and plant crops, were on the north side of the island. This is south of the equator.
One day.
But it turns out that they don't actually live in that habitat, right? So their habitat needs are such that they weren't in those areas. So anyway, I spent about 3 months doing research, sort of following leads on where they were and figuring out what habitat needs they had, and doing a bunch of GIS work to figure that out. And while I was there, I had a good relationship with the community because I had been a Peace Corps volunteer there. And while I was there, I was invited to come to a meeting where a UN delegation was there to determine whether the Comoros was a good site for biodiversity conservation project. And so I sat in on the meetings, and it was super interesting because the meetings were in French, but I spoke the local language because I was a Peace Corps volunteer. And it was super interesting to hear my colleagues and friends telling these like international folks from the UN and from the United Nations Environment Program and from the World Bank, like what they thought they wanted to hear, not what they actually thought. So I'd hear them talking in Comorian, and then they decide like, we're going to tell them this. And so, and again, they weren't trying to be dishonest, but they really wanted this project to come, and they thought they knew what these international folks wanted to hear. So anyway, it was really cool to have this insider perspective of what was going on and how this project was unfolding. So anyway, I was there for that. I went back to school. I had one more year of grad school after doing my fieldwork, or I guess one more semester. And I went back, and a job was posted. They ended up getting the funding. So it was a $5 million grant for 5 years to run a biodiversity conservation project in the Comoros to create national parks. And there were supposed to be 5 national parks created over 5 years across the 3 islands. And so there's a position posted for the staff ecologist. And so I was like, oh my gosh, this is my dream job. So I applied, and I went and worked as the staff ecologist on this conservation project through, it was World Bank funded, and it was run through the UN environmental program. And as you might imagine, things on a tropical island run pretty slowly, and Jeff can probably attest to that, working in the tropics. And so our accomplishment across 5 years was we created 1 national park with 10 no-take areas, which was still a huge accomplishment. It was in a country where there were no national parks, so there was a whole there was a lot of education that had to happen around what it meant to create a national park. The national parks were also created through this co-management perspective, whereby the communities helped decide where the parks would be, or what helped set the boundaries of the park and helped set the locations of the no-take reserves. And then they got to elect park guards that we then trained. Part of my job was to train, as the staff ecologist, was to train the park guards and the park guards were in charge of not just making sure people weren't poaching in the park, but also in terms of responsible for monitoring. And so you might recall that I was in grad school as a forest ecologist. The park that ended up getting prioritized due to some political reasons, I was supposed to actually work on another island where most of the fruit bats were, and I was supposed to be in charge of helping create the forest park, national park, for the fruit bats. But anyway, there were some political issues, and so as a punishment to that island, the president said, we're not sending any of our funding to that island. So I was sent to the other island that had this great marine ecosystem, and so I was then in charge of helping create the marine park. And I had taken 1 marine ecology class undergrad and 1 marine ecology class in grad school. And so that was the extent of my marine ecology background. And so I sat on a really slow dial-up connection doing a lot of research about the ecology of the West Indian Ocean. Anyway, and so I got really into marine ecology by teaching myself a lot of what was going on in the region. So then when I came back from that, so again, I had graduated from my master's, gone and done this job. I came back. I actually worked for the Smithsonian's biodiversity monitoring and assessment of biodiversity program for a year, and decided I really didn't like just sitting in an office and doing that. So I wanted to go to grad school and continue to do field work and field-based conservation work. And so I actually applied to programs to both do fruit bat research and marine ecology research, and got into programs for both. And I ended up choosing to come to Oregon State. And I see all of those folks at Oregon State over there in one of the windows, in Skip's window there. And so I did my PhD in the Lubchenco Mengi lab at Oregon State. Anyway, I guess I could keep on going, but basically I did research in on looking at mangrove forest coral reef ecology. So kind of merging my forest ecology and my marine ecology interests, because I was looking at a coastal forest and how it affected marine ecosystems. And I did most of my research in Panama, with some of my research also in Belize. And then, yeah, I guess long story short, I finished my dissertation. I actually, while I was finishing in my last year, I applied to a visiting professorship at Lewis and Clark College. So one of the professors was going on sabbatical and they needed someone to teach marine ecology. And so I applied and got that job. And then after I heard about that job, or while I was waiting to hear about that job, a position came up at Portland State University. And so I applied because I didn't know if I had this visiting professorship. And then anyway, I ended up getting both positions. I delayed my start at Portland State to be able to teach at Lewis and Clark. And then I started at PSU. So sorry, that was a really long-winded story, although my career has been longer than Ali and Jeff, so maybe that's okay that it takes me longer to get through it. But anyway, I welcome any questions for any of us. But yeah, I guess my message would be, it's okay to not know exactly what you want to do now, and it's okay to take opportunities as they come, because often one opportunity will lead to something else that you may not even have on your radar as a possible opportunity or interest. So I'll stop there and open it up for questions. I think there might be some in the chat.
Awesome. Thank you. The chat is mostly me commenting on how fascinated I am by everyone's stories. So yeah, students, if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I do think it would be useful to start with going back a little bit to, I think, what Jeff was about to talk about his project, and maybe like talk about the overarching questions that you are each working on before we get into more Q&A.
I also wanted to mention that, so Paul Hurst is also in our lab. His project is mostly freshwater, but he is doing work in the applied coastal ecology lab. So I don't know if you guys are interested in hearing, or if we want to start with Jeff's research, or whatever else you think is best. But
yeah. I didn't have the full view and didn't notice that Paul had joined in. Yeah, Paul, why don't you tell us just a little bit about your career trajectory as well?
Yeah, happily. Let's see, I don't have slides prepared either, but I probably have the straightest path of everyone who's talked so far. So in high school, like up until like my freshman year of college, I really wanted to be an emergency room doctor. That was my career path, and I was pursuing it very heavily. So one of the reasons why I went to Gonzaga was because they were putting in a medical school that was going to open the year I graduated. And that was one of the major decision factors for me. When I got to GU, I had a couple of professors that were like, really, is that what you want to do? It doesn't seem like you want to do that, because I was taking a bunch of environmental studies courses. And so eventually that challenge kind of got in my head, and I was like, I don't think I really want to do this. And so I switched my major. I became a double major in biology and environmental studies, and I stuck that out through the end of Gonzaga. I actually earned 2 degrees, one in each topic, which I was very proud of. And so my research path started at GU as well, in a freshwater lab with Dr. Betsy Bancroft, who was also an OSU grad in, I'm going to forget his name now. Elise, do you remember?
In Andy Blastein's lab.
Yeah, the Blaustein lab. Yeah,
and so she was in the same department as me. Yeah. Like we were in the same department together as grad students, not same lab.
Yeah, and Betsy, Dr. Bancroft is great. She researches frogs and salamanders, local amphibians in local to Spokane. And I got hired to help with a project. We did a multivariate experiment. We had 92, I think, individually monitored and heated tanks that we had all coded for, and we paired organisms, both native and invasive. So the pairings were either with an invasive and a native frog, or a native salamander with an invasive fish called the stickleback. And then we actually just published that research this last year, even just a couple of months ago, I think, actually. So that was my beginning research in undergrad, and it took a while for me to get into that. So when I first started looking, professors at the biology department did not want anything to do with me, not through any fault of my own, just because they had already filled up those positions for themselves. And so I think I applied to 10 different research labs my sophomore year, and not a single one of them took me. And so I worked the summer, and then got back into my biology classes and started trying to talk to professors a ton more than I already was. So I got in my junior year, and Betsy and I really hit it off. So I talked with her a lot. I would stay after class every day and go into her office hours. And finally, I asked her if I could be in her lab, and she had a great project going, that multivariate experiment, and one other. So I helped develop and run a survey of the Spokane River, looking at microplastic pollution across seasons. So I think I completed 11 months my senior year. I didn't quite get that full year, which was, I'll always regret that one, I guess. But we got 11 months of samples on the Spokane River across the full length of the river to look at the plastic pollution as it changed. And that was one of the big points that I brought to Elise. So I, like Elise mentioned, Betsy and I reached out to Elise. But I reached out to Elise. Betsy helped me develop all of that. And then I got a quick meeting. I think Allie was actually in my first meeting with the lab. I was very nervous. They joked around with me right when I got in about having a chemistry test, which was just so not okay. And then Elise and I had a one-on-one, and we really hit it off. Everything went well personally, and so I decided to come here for my graduate schooling, and now I'm in my third year. So I work on microplastics and juvenile salmon research and dispersion through freshwater mid-major rivers. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions about that, but that's what my career path has looked like so far. Yeah.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, so I feel like that's a good segue to the, we can hear what everyone else is specifically working on. But I did, in one of my emails out to the interns, let them know about the recent feature from OPB about the microplastics and like how plastic gets into the rivers. So very cool.
Oh, I guess I can go next. Green. So what I have been doing, sort of combining the research that Dr. Granick has been doing on microplastics and contaminants with my own experience working in mangrove ecosystems. For my project, we went up to Molokai, Hawaii, and we had this goal of examining mangroves in Hawaii, which are not native. Rhizophorus mango, red mangrove, was intentionally planted from Florida up to Hawaii to control erosion back in, I think, 1904. So it's interesting to see that there's this really interesting ecosystem that's been developing in Hawaii. And mangrove are interesting because they are halophytes. They grow in saltwater, and they have all of these cool adaptations in order to grow in saltwater. As you can see in this picture, they have these big root baffles. These root baffles form a lot of three-dimensional complicated structure that animals like to hide in. They can protect shorelines from erosion. They drop all of this organic matter that turns sediment into this, like, it builds up this like oxygen poor, organic rich sediment. And so these adaptations can also slow the flow of water through mangrove forests from like tidal action. And that allows suspended particles to drop down to the sediment, which helps mangrove build up sediment. But it can also allow things like microplastics to drop into the environment. So what we wanted to look at for this project is we wanted to take sediment cores and pore water. Pore water is the water that's in the sediments beneath surface water. They wanted to do this statistical comparison of these compartments between areas in Hawaii that had mangrove compared to areas that didn't have mangrove, to see if the environmental modifications developed by these mangrove species are having influence. This is important because since they are non-native in Hawaii, there is a lot of action to remove them. And sometimes they can rip out the mangrove in a way that can really liberate a lot of potentially stored contaminants. So that is my research.
Cool, thanks. I mean, I see the connection there from, the plastics are coming in from everywhere, all over the world, not just, locally in Hawaii, and then end up as these microplastics, which then can get trapped by the mangroves. And yeah, it's a cool link between multiple ecosystems.
Some of the people we talked to while we were on Hawaii actually did talk about how they would pull up like Coke bottles from the 70s
Wow.
out of the sediments.
All right, so then we'll take like 1 or 2 minutes just to hear what Allie's working on as well. And then Elise, if you have any other comments about overall lab things, that'd be great. But I do want to get time for questions as well. So
yeah, mine, it's kind of funny. I actually started out doing a master's, and I was planning on working with multiple stressors, looking at like microplastics and temperature on Dungeness crabs. And that lasted about 5 minutes. The clam project I mentioned was something that a PhD student in the lab was going to be working on, but he had moved away and didn't quite want to take on the tank experiment. And so I took over because I had experience in that in the past. And that ended up being, like I mentioned, kind of my crucial like switch into toxicology. And so after that, I actually switched to a PhD as well. So I did start out doing a master's, and I'm now doing a PhD because I loved it so much. And so yeah, my kind of drafted like dissertation title right now is Pesticides as Multiple Stressors on Aquatic Invertebrates. So microplastics are actually kind of my side hustle. I focus more on pesticides, but then I look at those like in combination. So I've actually gotten to help with, like, we wrote a chapter in a textbook on the effects of microfibers from textiles in the environment, which was really cool. And I learned a lot about that. And so I'm going to be kind of incorporating that in the future, looking at the combination of temperature, pesticides, and microfibers on sea star larvae. And then I'm hoping to do some like field work where you just applied for some funding, and hopefully that if we get that, it'd be really great. I'm hoping to work with some tribes on the coast of Oregon to monitor certain sites for pesticides, pharmaceuticals, all sorts of contaminants in eelgrass habitats. So yeah, I've kind of shifted from the intertidal inward a little bit, but so yeah, that's kind of my overall thing. So right now I'm working on a like hands-on thing. I'm doing a meta-analysis, which is just kind of like downloading every paper I can find on a specific, it's like 3 different pesticides, and I'm looking at the effects of those on organisms at environmental concentrations. So it's like a little bit of everything, which is really cool.
cool, thanks. And Elise, do you want to add anything about kind of overarching lab goals? I feel like we've got a good smattering of projects here.
Yeah, I did want to just mention one thing, because Skip put in the chat about how I had been a GK12 fellow at OSU he was co-running the program there. And I did want to mention that just in terms of like the windiness of paths, that originally when I went to grad school, I went to go get a PhD because I wanted to work for a conservation organization doing biodiversity conservation. And so I had no intention of being a professor ever. If you told me when I went to grad school I was going to be a professor, I'd be like, you're crazy, no way. So, but that experience, I taught 6th and 7th grade science in middle school in Corvallis, and I really liked teaching. And I also had a number of undergraduate students working as sort of volunteers on my own dissertation research, the way Ali and Jeff and Paul have now. And I really liked mentoring. And again, it was something that I didn't know. I had never had experiences mentoring in that way. So again, don't rule out things, but also just, taking what comes along is a good way to sort of figure out, what you like and what you don't like. Some things you won't like. You'll try them and you won't like them. And, that's good to know too. Yeah, so our lab actually, sorry, everyone's home because we have a COVID case in our household. I apologize for all the chaos here. The only other thing I wanted to mention is that we do a lot of applied work around sort of natural science, but we also in our lab do work around the social side of things. And so we do things like trying to understand people's perspectives and attitudes around microplastics and emerging contaminants. We have done things like one of my graduate students worked with the Oregon Coast Aquarium to develop an exhibit for the aquarium on microplastics and marine organisms and ecosystems. So although we are, when we say applied coastal ecology, we mostly do and try to understand organisms and effects and that sort of thing, but we also do work trying to understand the human side of things. So I just wanted to mention that as well.
Yeah, awesome. So now let's open up to questions. If you are a student and you have a question, please put it in the chat and then I'll call on you. I have so many questions, so I can start while people are thinking, but just a first one, can we just see a show of hands among Paul, Allie, and Jeff? Which of you think that you'd like to be a professor and stay in academia versus, we got one, so Paul's raising, Paul's up, we've got a maybe not. So I'm curious to hear from all three of you, just like what your ideal kind of career after grad school would be.
Sure. Yeah, so optimally for me, I'd really like to teach. I've really fallen in love with that. And hopefully at a PUI like UP or Gonzaga, somewhere like that. I had a really great experience there, and I'd really love to emulate that for other students and lift them up the way Betsy was able to for me, and the way Elise does now. So as long as I'm doing that, I think I'm going to be pretty happy.
Nice. I'll just interject to say for the students in the room who may not know that PUI stands for primarily undergraduate institution, which is different from, say, OSU or U of O, which have a very large population of graduate students as well. So just a little clarification there that I definitely didn't know back in the day. How about you, Allie?
Mine's definitely a maybe. I love teaching and mentoring. I think having most of my graduate experience be during a pandemic, it's made it a little difficult, and I might be a little burnout on academia for the moment, but I'm not totally ruling it out, because I honestly love being that presence. I think like those professors that really inspired me early on made that impact, and I would love to have that experience with other students. And I feel like on some level, hopefully I do have that as a TA, but I would actually love to go a little more directly and work in some sort of agency, especially it's kind of a hot time right now in Oregon with the regulation on pesticides, especially with the forestry industry, which I didn't mention. That was what my first project was looking at, but I think it'd be cool to have like a more direct kind of impact there, and get even more like hands-on experience before potentially maybe one day being a professor, but it's hard to say right now. Again, kind of like Elise mentioned, I'm kind of taking things as they come to me. I feel like I still have a lot more learning to do. So
yeah, I feel like in the research world, there's a lot of options and then also a lot of chance occurrences that kind of lead to what happens next, which I think you kind of all touched on in saying like, oh, well, I met this person through this person, and then that led to this next step. And we'll just hear quickly from Jeff about your plan moving on, and then maybe we've got a question from Margaret about what other careers can you go into with a PhD besides staying in academia? So like, what are the other options that you're thinking about?
That's probably a good question to follow up what I'm going to say, because I am choosing not to do a PhD at this stage in my life. I actually recently got married, and my wife and I would like to have kids. So she works long hours, and getting a PhD is kind of long hours. So I'll also take my master's and then maybe find a position on the master's that is closer to what I've done in the past. So like in labs, there's a position called lab manager, which is usually a master's position. It's below the PI of the lab, where you're kind of running the day-to-day. And I would love to do that because I love field work, and I would like to stay in the field. And as you get your PhD, the positions that follow are sometimes less oriented around doing active in the field research. As my kids get older, I may revisit the PhD issue, but just for now, in the short term, this might make sense.
Yeah, cool. I like to hear that. It's not a straight direct path. You can always go back and do a PhD later. Yeah, so I feel like that's a good question for, those of you who did decide to do a PhD. Do you feel like when you were going to it, and maybe going back to Elise as well, because you were saying you didn't want to be a professor originally. So like, what kind of trajectory did you initially have? Like, what are the types of jobs that you're really interested in before you started teaching? Not sure if Elise is available at the moment because of what's going on at home, but maybe Allie, we could go back to you and like what other jobs you're thinking about.
That's funny. I feel like I've always kind of done things backwards. I actually didn't think about the job part. I knew I wanted to keep going in school, to keep learning and everything. And then when I switched to the PhD, it was more like someone had told me that if you are like ready to devote your life to the like eternal knowledge of a certain subject, it kind of makes sense to stick with a PhD. And I was like, that's me. And then afterwards I was like, oh, okay. So it does limit kind of, or maybe not limit, but it molds a little more what you are going to do in the future. Because I will say from what I have heard, a lot of places won't hire folks with a PhD if you're overqualified because of pay grade and what have you. It's like kind of complicated, but I actually went to this really cool session at a conference. They did kind of a meet and greet virtually with experts in the field. And so you could talk to people from academia, consulting, and then also from agency. And so that was kind of the broad, or like those were the people that I talked to. I think there are things outside of that, but so basically for environmental science, you can go into like a consulting agency where people come to you and you kind of research a certain issue and then give them what you think is like your best understanding and like give them your advice, which I had thought about doing, but apparently it's pretty unpredictable work. And so with my brain, like I need something a little more continuous. And so like I had heard from somebody at NOAA and also the EPA, and they absolutely love their job. Like for toxicologists, they're in a lab and it's kind of like a 9-to-5 deal. You work on your project and then you go home and you have a work-life balance. And so that for me sounds really cool. And then potentially actually having some like influence with policy, especially with an agency like NOAA, would be really cool. And then even before that, like you can do postdoc positions, which are pretty cool. When I was in Chile, I actually worked with 2 postdocs. One of them was from Italy, and he actually did his like PhD in South Africa. And so I got to learn a lot from him. And then there was another one from Spain who then went to like Iceland to do another postdoc after that. So like you can travel and kind of do more projects and learn more things. So there's a lot of fun options, but yeah, that's kind of my take.
And I'll just interject here too, because I have a lot of other experience having gotten a PhD and then deciding what to do afterwards. And so I did my PhD at UCLA in sea slug evolution, and then did a postdoc at the California Academy of Sciences, still working on sea slug evolution. And I kind of just knew that I was more passionate about education all along. And so while a PhD is a really great option when you're really you're just excited about the research itself and you want to put that time in, I really loved doing that. But as Jeff mentioned, the kind of further along you get in your career, the less time you're actually spending, in the field doing work, research, and it gets to be a little bit more administrative. And so, now I was really lucky that Saturday Academy is an organization that they were happy to hire me with a PhD at, a job that doesn't require a PhD. And so it's really fun being able to work with all of you. And I wouldn't say that I was, limited by the fact that I got a PhD by any means. Yeah.
I was just going to add that I've graduated 4 PhDs, I think, and none of them are in academia. So one works for the Ocean Conservancy, one works for an organization called World Fish, I think it's called, and she does both research and community work around fish conservation, and she's worked in all over the world. Actually, I think she's in Cambodia right now, for the last year or two. And then I have two more recent PhD students that are both have positions through Oregon that they've gotten through Oregon Sea Grant, but one's working directly with Oregon Sea Grant and one's working with DEQ, Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. So yeah, so you definitely don't have to go into academia with a PhD, because none of my grad students are. So yeah.
And I actually have a good segue / plug for a future Lunch and Learn on this topic, which is that my friend, Dr. Sam Cheng, did her PhD with, we were in the same lab together. And she's going to be talking about her career, which intersects with some of the things that Elise was talking about earlier, about making decisions about conservation, like making a new national park or putting in new policies, and how important it is for international organizations to work with local scientists and keep their interests in mind. And so Sam is now the director of conservation evidence at the World Wildlife Fund. And so, she's working for a nonprofit and putting in all of that research experience. So come back August 4th to hear from Sam Cheng. It is now 1. I still have questions. If anyone wants to hang out longer and talk more, I feel like we could keep this party going. If you do have to leave, feel free to go.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We'll see if any students do end up staying longer. But we'll give them a little bit of time to log off if they have to. Skip, is your lab going to hang out a bit longer?
Yeah, a couple of them are going to stay. Bronte worked in the lab, so she's attentively listening.
Awesome.
Hi, Bronte. How's college?
Come up here. She's going to move up here so she can.
Okay.
Yeah, let's hear from Bronte about how your career path is going after we're having worked with Elise previously.
And Allie.
Hi, yeah, I did my internship. I used to cover 2020 in the ACE lab, working with Allie's project on pesticides and plants. And I kind of knew at that point that I was interested in oceanography and chemical engineering, and I was kind of looking for ways to combine that. And so learning about toxicology and that sort of thing really kind of guided my interest in research. And now I'm doing work at Oregon State University.
One more try.
A chemical engineering degree with a minor in oceanography. And I'm working in Dr. Kip's lab, obviously, working on
Trying to get you on the screen. She's coming.
working on a project with hydrogel and oh, there I am, and removing
Wait.
and removing contaminants from groundwater using bacteria inside of hydrogel. And
So
that's
cool.
really, yeah, it's kind of really combining that pesticides, well, they're not pesticides, but kind of the toxicology with the chemical engineering. So yeah, that was really exciting. And I'm really grateful for Allie and everyone else in the lab for their research.
Skip, talk about full circle. So Skip was the coordinator of the, like I said, the GK12 fellowship that I had. So part of why I figured out I really like teaching. So that's awesome.
Yeah, I feel like this actually, one of my questions for all of you really is how, so it, like I was saying earlier, it's having these connections with people and maintaining those over time, I think really has led to more opportunities. So any kind of reflections on that? Is it difficult to make those initial connections and network in this world? And, do you have any tips for students about how to do that?
Well, I'll just say that I have a high school program, and Bronte was in my high school program in what year, 2019, maybe?
I think so,
Yeah, the year before she did ASE, and that's where I met her. But I also had her dad as a student the first year I was at OSU. It is all about connections, right?
Yeah, that's knowing you as a
I know.
professor.
Talk about full circle. Oh my gosh.
I'll probably have Bronte's kids too. No pressure, no pressure. Yeah, no pressure.
Pressure on your
And
children.
skip that means you can't ever retire.
True.
Yeah, I'm just gonna die right here.
Yeah.
That's about right.
It does.
But in a couple.
I was gonna add to something that, like, when I was younger, when I was first starting my grad school search before I moved to Chile, I talked to Bruce Mengi, actually. Like, I thought about joining or like applying to his lab, but I wasn't ready to do a PhD at that point. But I remember when I knew I was gonna meet him, I was so scared. Like, he was on all the papers we read in my marine ecology class in undergrad. He was a giant, you know. It's just like, I'm gonna meet this like intertidal god. And I feel like a lot of us do that, where we kind of just think of scientists as these like unapproachable people who are like kind of famous in their own way. And then I met him, and he was like the chillest, quiet, you know, he was wearing like a Hawaiian shirt and flip-flops, and he was so nice, you know. And I was just like, oh, I shouldn't have been so nervous. And like I can't even express how nervous I was. And so that was like my biggest takeaway, was really just like, we're all people. And I've seen it at conferences where like friends and colleagues of mine have been afraid to go up to scientists to talk to them. And like, those are the key moments in which you make those connections, right? Like, had I not talked to Sergio, I never would have lived in Chile. And like, those 3 years completely changed my life, right? And so you kind of got to just like, go for it. We're all people. We're all here to talk. And yeah, and definitely keep in touch. Like, I still talk to my advisor from undergrad, and we like nerd out about polykeys a lot.
I totally agree with Ellie. And if you meet someone that's not acting like a real
Who's
person
that?
and isn't nice, you probably don't want to work with them. So
Yeah, better to learn early. And you know, there's nothing to lose, because you didn't know them before you went up to talk to them. And then if they weren't very nice, well, now you still don't know them. So breaks even.
Just kind of to add on with Allie, one of the things that always helped me feel a little less nervous when talking to some of those folks was reading like one of their most recent papers, so that I'd have something to talk to them about, and they'd always be super excited to talk about it, right? Because like they'd spent a year working on it. So that was always a good tip for me.
Yeah, I've definitely done that too. All right, how are we feeling time-wise? It's really, I think just Skip's lab is our lingering students, because you know, we could talk forever, but we don't need to be like an echo chamber about how great being a marine ecologist is.
well, I'm glad to hear, Bronte, that things are going well. It sounds like at OSU. That's awesome.
Yeah,
That
So-
thing. Where's that thing?
That's right.
All right.
Help me measure like 1 million clams. Super awesome.
yeah.
I will say how about we'll make this the last question, but we heard a lot of fun stories about adventuring and field work and all of that, which is always, I think, the most fun part of this type of work. But what keeps you motivated when you're back at your desk, like just writing?
Sour Patch Kids.
You get one for every page you write.
I set them on the paper, and when I get there, I get to eat the Sour Patch Kid.
I've always experienced a pretty good balance between field work, lab work, and computer work. So I guess I just remember the good times and know that they'll come around again.
Yeah, that's definitely why I have so many photos. I like pull them up and I'm like, I also, for me specifically with toxicology, there are like a few cases that I learned about in undergrad that like really got me interested in it. And I kind of go over them again. Like there's the Minamata Bay case that everyone has heard me talk about a ton. That one for me really like keeps me motivated to work in toxicology, and I'll read about like or like one of my personal heroes is like Dr. Tyrone Hayes, and like I'll read some of his stuff sometimes, and it really like reminds me of what I'm doing it for. And yeah, it's especially tricky in pandemic, right? We're all kind of like doing our own things, but I like the Sour Patch Kid idea. I'm gonna try or Skittles maybe. I like
Skittles, yeah. I was just gonna say that. For some reason, like candy, I shouldn't be like plugging, I mean, whatever. I'll just do it. Candy is the best, like writing, like keeping you awake if you're tired, sort of just like gives, I don't know, something about the sugar just inspires ideas or something. It's just best for writing. All right, well, I think we will close out with that. Okay, Jeff's commenting the candy makes him lose focus, which, okay, that's a good counter argument against the candy. We need to show both sides. But yeah, thank you all so much for being here. This was really fun, and keep coming back. We're gonna keep having fun lunch and learns.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. I want to make a separate plug. Bronte, did you hear about the ACE alum event that's coming up in July?
Yeah, well, since I'm in Corvallis at OSU and it's on a Thursday, I wouldn't really be able to make it, unfortunately. But it
Good point.
Yeah,
If you are able to make it, we would love to see you. And Elise and Ali, you're both invited as well if you're in Portland. And if you haven't gotten the information, let us know. Yeah, we'd love to see you, Bronte, if you're able to come.
I do know Skip let us know that I think that's the week of his other high school program. So there's probably going to be a lot going on in the lab that week, but hopefully we'll see you in person soon.
Thank you all so much for all of your thoughtful insights. It was a great lunch and learn today.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having us.
Great to see everybody.
All right. Thanks again. Bye.